November 1941. A German POW captured in North Africa arrived at an Australian camp expecting a primitive backwater colony barely clinging to survival. But within weeks, he discovered something that shattered everything the Nazi regime had told him. His captors were throwing away more food than his family back home saw in months. Children drank fresh milk daily, and farms operated with machinery he'd never seen in Germany's finest factories. When Georg Scheuerler walked away from a work detail in 1945 and vanished into the Outback, police assumed the harsh desert had killed him within days. But what they found 30 years later would prove that sometimes the greatest escape isn't from captivity, but from the lies you were told to believe. So how does a man disappear for 3 decades in plain sight? And what did he discover about the country he was supposed to hate that made him never want to leave? The world was at war, and Australia sat on the edge of everything. While German submarines hunted ships across the Atlantic Ocean and Hitler's armies marched deeper into Russia, Australia faced a problem nobody had planned for. Thousands of enemy soldiers were being captured in the deserts of North Africa, and someone had to figure out what to do with them. The Australian government made a decision that seemed simple at the time. They would build prison camps in the most remote, empty parts of the country, places so far from anything that escape would mean certain death in the wilderness. The camps went up fast across the interior. Wooden guard towers, barbed wire fences, rows of simple huts with metal roofs that turned into ovens under the summer sun. Camp 13, near the town of Cowra in New South Wales, became one of the largest. By late 1941, it held 4,000 prisoners. Most were German, some were Italian. All of them had been told the same stories about Australia before they arrived. It was a backwards place, a colony of criminals, a land where nothing grew and nobody had enough of anything. The camp stretched across flat, dry land that seemed to go on forever. Guard towers stood 200 metres apart, connected by fences that ran 800 metres in each direction. Guards rotated shifts every 6 hours. They followed the rules of the Geneva Convention strictly. Prisoners received adequate food, medical care, and shelter. They could write letters home once a month. They could read newspapers, though the news was always weeks old by the time it arrived. Among the 4,000 faces behind the wire was Georg Scheuerler. He was 24 years old. Before the war, he had worked as a mechanic in Stuttgart. He knew how to fix engines, repair trucks, and keep machines running. The army had trained him, given him a uniform, and sent him to North Africa with Rommel's forces. The desert campaign had not gone well. He'd been captured in one of the early battles, loaded onto a ship, and sent halfway around the world to this place that was supposed to be nowhere. Georg had believed what he'd been told. Australia was primitive, the people were poor, the land was empty and useless. They had no real industry, no proper culture, no way to match Germany's strength. He expected to find a struggling colony, barely able to feed itself, let alone guard thousands of prisoners properly. But from the first week, things didn't match up. The guards ate well, not just adequate rations, but actual meals with fresh bread, meat, and vegetables. When supply trucks arrived at the camp gates every week, they were loaded with more food than Georg had seen in months back home. Fresh potatoes, crates of oranges, sides of beef, real butter, white sugar. The guards didn't hoard these things or portion them out carefully. They used them freely, sometimes even wasting them. Georg watched a guard throw away half a sandwich one afternoon, just toss it in the garbage because he wasn't hungry anymore. Back in Germany, his mother would have saved that bread for 3 days. His sister would have scraped every crumb from the plate. But here, in this supposed backwater, food was so common that people threw it away. The camp commandant was a career military man who ran things by the book. He was fair but strict. One day during roll call, he mentioned casually that Australia was shipping wheat and wool overseas at record levels. Entire cargo ships full of grain leaving Sydney Harbour every week. Millions of sheep across the countryside, producing more wool than the mills could process. Georg heard these numbers and couldn't make sense of them. Germany was fighting for resources, fighting for oil, for grain, for basic supplies to keep the war machine running. But their enemies had so much, they were selling it to other countries. Then came the work program. Prisoners could volunteer for jobs on local farms. The pay was small, just a few pounds a month, but the conditions were better than sitting behind wire. Men who volunteered got to leave the camp during the day. They worked alongside Australian farmhands. They saw the countryside. They ate the same food as the workers. Georg signed up immediately. Anything was better than staring at the same fences every day. He put his name on the list for farm work and waited. In March 1942, 5 months after arriving at Camp 13, his name was called. He would work at a sheep station 80 kilometers from camp. A truck picked him up along with 5 other prisoners. Guards rode with them, rifles across their laps. But they weren't rough or cruel. One of them offered Georg a cigarette. Real tobacco, not the terrible substitutes he'd smoked in North Africa. The drive took 2 hours on dirt roads that cut through endless stretches of dry grassland. Georg stared out the back of the truck at the landscape rolling past. It was brown and harsh, but not empty. He saw fences running for kilometers, windmills pumping water, herds of sheep moving across distant hills in numbers he couldn't count. Telegraph poles lined the road. Someone had strung wire all the way out here, connecting even these remote places to the rest of the world. When they arrived at the station, Georg saw something that made him stop and stare. The property stretched to the horizon in every direction. The main house was large and well built, with a metal roof and glass windows. Behind it stood shearing sheds, bigger than any barn he'd seen in Germany. Tractors sat in neat rows, a workshop with proper tools, a water tank that could hold thousands of litres, and everywhere sheep. More sheep than he'd ever imagined existing in one place. The station owner was a man named Cooper. He was in his 50s, weathered by sun and work, but strong and healthy. He shook Georg's hand like they were equals, not prisoner and captor. He explained the work: fence repairs, equipment maintenance, general labour. Nothing too complicated. Georg would sleep in the workers' quarters with the other farmhands. He would eat the same meals they did. He would work the same hours. That first night, sitting in the mess hall with Australian workers and fellow prisoners, Georg ate dinner and realised something was terribly wrong with everything he'd been told. The meal wasn't survival rations, it was abundance. And this was just the beginning of his education. The first morning at the sheep station, Georg woke before dawn to the sound of a bell ringing. He dressed quickly and walked to the mess hall, expecting thin porridge and black bread. Instead, he found a table loaded with food that made his stomach twist with confusion. Fresh eggs fried in butter, thick strips of bacon, bread so white and soft it seemed like cake, real tea with milk and sugar that workers spooned into their cups without measuring. The other farmhands ate like this was normal, like this was just another Tuesday breakfast, nothing special at all. Georg sat down carefully and filled his plate with small portions. He didn't want to seem greedy, but the station cook, a woman named Mrs. Henderson, walked over and piled more eggs onto his plate without asking. She told him workers needed their strength. She said this was standard fare, every single morning. Georg did the math in his head while he ate. The calories on his plate added up to more than 2,800. Back home, German soldiers on the front lines were supposed to get 3,000 calories a day, but usually got far less. Here, farm workers ate like kings and complained if the bacon was too crispy. Cooper assigned Georg to the workshop that first week. The mechanic's shed contained tools Georg had only dreamed about. American-made wrenches in every size. A full set of socket drivers. Pneumatic equipment powered by a compressor that ran on abundant petrol. The tractor parts were newer and better designed than anything he'd worked on in the Wehrmacht motor pools. When Georg mentioned this to the head mechanic, an older Australian named Bill, the man just shrugged. He said the equipment came from America, shipped over in bulk. Nothing special about it. But it was special to Georg. Each tool represented manufacturing capability, the precision of the metal cutting, the standardization of sizes, the sheer volume of production required to make these tools so common that a remote sheep station had multiple sets sitting around. Germany's factories were running day and night, trying to produce enough weapons and vehicles. Yet here, civilian farms had better equipment than military units. The scale of the station itself shocked him more each day. Cooper told him the property ran 45,000 sheep across 120,000 acres. Georg tried to picture this. 45,000 animals. The station employed only 12 workers to manage them all. Back in Germany, that many sheep would require a small village of people. But here, mechanization made it possible. Machines did the work of 50 men. The shearing sheds had electric motors, conveyor belts, sorting systems. Everything moved with industrial efficiency. One afternoon, Georg watched a refrigerated truck arrive with a delivery. The driver unloaded crates of ice. Actual ice, made in a factory and driven hours into the Outback just to keep the workers' beer cold. Not to preserve medicine, not to save food from spoiling, just for cold beer on hot afternoons. Georg accepted a bottle from Bill and drank it slowly. The coldness hurt his teeth. The taste was clean and sharp. Bill drank his in 4 long swallows and grabbed another from the icebox. The abundance revealed itself in small moments that added up to something Georg couldn't ignore. Mrs. Henderson served oranges with lunch one day. Georg mentioned he'd never tasted an orange before the war. The next morning, she brought him a wooden crate containing 50 oranges from the property's orchard. She told him they usually just squeezed them for juice or let the extras rot on the ground. There were too many to use. Georg held one of the oranges in his hand and thought about his sister in Stuttgart, who would have treasured a single orange like gold. The other prisoners on the work detail noticed the same things. They talked about it quietly in the evenings. One man had worked at a different station where the owner had a private telephone line to Sydney. Another had seen the wool buyers arrive in trucks so new the paint still shined. They were all doing the same math, adding up the evidence, comparing what they'd been told with what they could see with their own eyes. In July, Cooper needed supplies from town and took Georg along on the drive to Cowra. The town had a population of barely 4,000 people. Georg expected a rough frontier settlement, maybe a few wooden buildings and dirt streets. Instead, he found paved roads, electric streetlights, a hospital with X-ray machines, 3 churches with bells that actually rang, 2 cinemas showing Hollywood films on real screens. The shops were stocked with goods, women's stockings, men's shoes, tinned food, fresh vegetables, cigarettes stacked in displays so tall Georg could have built a wall from them. Children ran past on the sidewalk, drinking bottles of fresh milk. Their cheeks were round and healthy. They wore shoes with no holes. A man stood outside a shop smoking a cigarette, and after 3 puffs, he dropped it on the ground and crushed it under his boot. 3 puffs, then waste. Georg had seen German soldiers collect cigarette butts from the ground to salvage the last bits of tobacco. Here, men threw them away, barely used. Cooper bought supplies at the general store. The shopkeeper loaded bags of flour, sugar, and tea into the truck bed without checking ration books. There were no ration books. People just bought what they needed. Cooper paid in cash, and the shopkeeper gave him change without counting it twice. The transaction was easy and casual, like food was something you could always get more of. On the drive back, Georg asked Cooper about the war. He asked carefully, not wanting to offend. Cooper told him Australia was shipping food and materials across the Pacific. Wheat to India, beef to Britain, wool to America. The country was feeding its own people and half the Allied forces as well. Cooper said the Americans were just getting started with their production. He said the factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh were turning out planes and tanks faster than anyone could count them. He said this war would be won by whoever had the most resources, and Germany had picked a fight with countries that had more than they knew what to do with. Georg sat quietly and watched the landscape pass. He thought about the propaganda he'd heard. Germany was strong. Germany was fighting for survival. Germany needed living space and resources. But if survival meant having enough, then these people had already survived. They were beyond survival. They were living in a kind of plenty that seemed almost wasteful. Back at the station that evening, George joined the other prisoners for dinner. Roasted lamb, potatoes with gravy, fresh carrots, bread with real butter. Italian prisoners from another work camp had joined them for the week. They shared stories during the meal. One had worked at a shipyard in Sydney and counted 6 cargo ships being built at the same time. Another described seeing tens of thousands of American troops moving through Brisbane. Each soldier carried chocolate bars and cigarettes as standard issue, things German officers couldn't get. Late that night, George couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling. Another prisoner named Klaus whispered from the next bed. He said what they were all thinking. They had been told they were fighting for resources Germany needed to survive, but their enemies threw away more than Germany produced. Klaus's voice trailed off into silence. Neither of them finished the thought, but both of them understood. Something fundamental had shifted. The story they'd believed was crumbling, and there was no way to put it back together. The months passed, and George settled into the rhythm of station work. He repaired fences under the hot sun. He fixed tractors and maintained equipment. He learned the land and the language better with each passing week. His English improved from broken phrases to full conversations. The Australian workers treated him fairly. They shared their tea breaks with him. They taught him their slang and laughed when he tried to copy their accent. Sometimes George almost forgot he was a prisoner. Then the guards would arrive to take him back to camp for the night, and reality returned. August 1944 arrived with winter cold that felt strange after the brutal summer heat. The Australians had a tradition George found bizarre at first. They celebrated Christmas in July, a mock holiday in the middle of winter, to experience something like a European winter celebration. Cooper invited the work detail prisoners to the main house for a special dinner. Georg expected a polite gesture, maybe some extra rations shared out of kindness. A small meal to show goodwill. Nothing more than that. He was completely wrong. The Cooper family dining room had a long wooden table covered with a white cloth. Mrs. Cooper and her daughters spent all day cooking. The smell of roasting meat filled the entire house. When Georg and 5 other prisoners arrived, cleaned up and nervous, the family greeted them like guests. Not prisoners, not enemies. Just people who'd been invited to share a meal. The food came out in waves that seemed impossible. A roasted lamb so large it took 2 people to carry the platter. Potatoes drowning in rich brown gravy. Fresh carrots and peas. Bread rolls with butter. Then dessert arrived. Plum pudding with cream so thick you could stand a spoon in it. Cooper poured beer for everyone without hesitation. The bottles kept coming. Georg tried to pace himself, but the family kept refilling his glass. The Cooper children played after dinner. They had toys made from real metal and rubber. Materials that Germany hoarded for the war effort were here being used for children's playthings. A toy truck with rubber wheels. Metal soldiers painted in bright colours. A ball that bounced perfectly because it was made from real rubber. Not the terrible substitutes German children had to use. The youngest Cooper girl, maybe 7 years old, had a doll with a porcelain face and a dress with actual buttons. She played with it carelessly, the way children do when they have other toys waiting in their room. Mrs. Cooper brought out photograph albums after the children went to bed. She showed Georg pictures of family holidays at the beach. Her previous home in Sydney with a garden full of flowers. Their eldest son, who was serving in New Guinea, wearing his uniform and smiling at the camera. She talked about missing him, about worrying every day, about hoping he'd come home safe when the war ended. Cooper asked Georg about his family. The question was simple and kind, but answering it broke something loose inside Georg's chest. He described his mother in Stuttgart, how she got 200 grams of meat per week if she was lucky, how his family's apartment went dark during air raids and stayed dark because there was no fuel for lights, how his sister Maria wore shoes with soles made from cardboard because leather was impossible to find, how his father worked in a factory that kept cutting rations while demanding longer hours. The words came out slowly at first, then faster. Georg talked about the letters from home that took months to arrive, about how his mother wrote that she was fine, but he could read between the lines and know she was hungry, about how Maria had written about her shoes once, trying to make it sound funny, but Georg knew it meant she was walking through snow with cardboard soles that dissolved in the wet. The room went quiet when he finished. Mrs. Cooper had tears in her eyes. Cooper refilled Georg's glass and sat back in his chair. He looked at Georg for a long moment before speaking. He said something Georg would never forget. Your government told you we were weak. But mate, we're just getting started. America hasn't even fully mobilized yet. The words hung in the air like smoke. Georg understood what Cooper meant. This abundance, this overwhelming plenty, this casual waste of resources, Germany would kill for. This was just the beginning. The machine was still warming up. The factories were still increasing production. The farms were still expanding output. And on the other side of the Pacific, America had barely started converting its massive industrial capacity to war production. Georg had been fighting for Germany's survival. That's what they'd told him, that Germany needed resources, that Germany had to expand to live, that their enemies were weak and desperate. But sitting in that dining room, full of food his mother would cry to see, Georg finally understood the truth. Germany hadn't been fighting for survival. Germany's leaders had chosen war. They had chosen it while their enemies lived in abundance. Those leaders couldn't even imagine. That night, walking back to the workers' quarters, Georg made a decision. Not to escape back to Germany, but to escape from returning to Germany. The idea formed slowly, carefully, like ice crystals growing on glass. He couldn't go back. Not to the bombed cities, not to the shortages, not to whatever defeat waited at the end of this war. He'd seen something here that he couldn't unsee. A place where ordinary people lived better than German officers. A place where children drank milk every day and played with rubber balls. A place where the future wasn't about fighting for scraps. February 1945 arrived, with news filtering through the camp that Germany was losing badly. The Eastern Front had collapsed. The Western Allies were crossing into Germany itself. The end was coming fast and ugly. Prisoners who'd been confident and proud 3 years ago now looked worried. They faced returning to a Germany that would be destroyed and defeated. A Germany that would be occupied and broken. A Germany where Georg's family was probably already dead or dying. Georg volunteered for every remote work detail he could get. He learned the landscape during long days fixing fences in areas far from the main station. He studied the stars at night and figured out directions. He memorized where water could be found, which properties might hire a skilled mechanic without asking too many questions, which roads to avoid, how to move at night when the heat was less deadly. The station hands taught him without knowing they were teaching him. They showed him how to read the land, where abandoned mining camps stood empty, which towns were too small to have regular police patrols. He saved every penny of his work wages, £17 accumulated over months of careful saving. He bought a swag from a farmhand who was getting a new one. He collected tools slowly, a wrench here, a screwdriver there, nothing that would be missed from the well-stocked workshop. He practiced his English until the accent was almost right. He learned Australian slang and customs. He became George instead of Georg. He prepared himself to become someone else. May 1945 brought the news everyone expected. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Camp 13 received orders to prepare prisoners for repatriation. Ships would come. Men would be loaded aboard. They would sail back to whatever remained of their homeland. The process would take months, but it would happen. Every prisoner would eventually go home. Except Georg had no intention of going home. In June, during a fence repair detail 40 kilometres from the main station, Georg simply walked away. He picked a moment when the guard was checking something on the truck. He walked into the bush, carrying his swag and his small collection of tools. He had 17 pounds in his pocket. He had skills that were valuable anywhere. He had knowledge of the land and the language. And he had the absolute certainty that dying free in the Australian outback was better than living in defeated Germany. The guards discovered him missing 2 hours later. They searched for 2 weeks. They checked every station and town within 100 kilometres. They assumed, like everyone did, that the bush would kill him. The heat, the distance, the lack of water. They expected to find his body eventually, but they never did. Georg Scheuerler vanished into Australia like a stone dropped into deep water. And for 30 years, no one knew where he'd gone. Georg walked through the night using the stars to guide him north. He avoided the main roads and stuck to fence lines where he could move without leaving obvious tracks. The swag on his back held everything he owned. 2 changes of clothes, his tools wrapped in cloth to keep them from rattling, a canteen of water that would last maybe 2 days if he was careful. The 17 pounds in his pocket represented months of saved wages. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start. The first week was the hardest. He moved only at night and hid during the day under whatever cover he could find. Rock outcroppings, dense brush. Once an abandoned shepherd's hut with half a roof. He knew the search parties would be looking for him, but he also knew they'd give up eventually. The Outback killed people regularly. Lost hikers, foolish tourists. Even experienced bushmen made mistakes and died from heat or thirst. The authorities would assume he was dead within a month. They just needed to not find his body. He rationed his water carefully and found more at a windmill-fed trough on the 8th day. The property looked abandoned or rarely visited. He filled his canteen and kept moving. On the 10th day, he risked approaching a small station far off any main road. The owner was an old man who worked the property alone. Georg offered to fix a broken water pump in exchange for a meal. He gave his name as George Schaffer, a German immigrant who'd come to Australia before the war. The old man didn't ask many questions. He fed Georg stew and bread and paid him £2 for the repair work. That became Georg's pattern. He moved from property to property, always staying beyond the 100-kilometre radius where police were actively searching for an escaped prisoner. He worked odd jobs: fence repairs, equipment maintenance, plumbing work, anything that used his mechanical skills. He told people he was George Schaffer, immigrant tradesman, moving around looking for steady work. Most believed him because they had no reason not to. Rural Australia had plenty of drifters and workers who moved from job to job. One more didn't raise suspicions. He learned to blend in by watching and listening. He copied the way Australians stood and moved. He practiced their casual attitude toward authority. He learned to drink beer the right way and complain about the weather like a local. His English improved until only the faintest accent remained. He became George Schaefer so completely that Georg Scheuerler started to feel like someone else, someone from another life. The months turned into years. Georg worked construction in small towns. He learned plumbing and became good at it. He moved every few months at first, always cautious, always ready to disappear again. But gradually he relaxed. The search had ended. No one was looking for him anymore. He was just another working man in the Australian countryside, invisible in plain sight. In 1952, 7 years after walking away from that work detail, Georg met a woman named Mary in a town called Goulburn. She worked at the general store. She had red hair and freckles and a laugh that made him feel like he'd finally come home. He courted her carefully, terrified she'd discover his secret. But when he finally told her the truth, expecting her to turn him in, she surprised him. She said everyone deserved a second chance. She said the war was over and he'd done nothing wrong in Australia. She said she loved George Schaefer, whoever he'd been before. They married in 1953. Georg became a father in 1954 when their daughter was born, then a son in 1956. He worked steady jobs now: plumbing, construction, general maintenance. He paid taxes under his assumed name. He joined the local football club and helped coach the youth team. He and Mary saved money slowly and carefully. They dreamed of owning their own business someday. In 1968, that dream came true. The Rose and Crown pub in the tiny settlement of Bungendore came up for sale. The town had a population of 823 people. It was small and quiet and far from anywhere important. Perfect for a man who wanted to disappear. Georg and Mary bought the pub with their savings and a small bank loan. They moved their family to Bungendore and became part of the community. Georg ran the pub well. He served good beer and fair prices. He listened to customers' problems and offered advice when asked. He extended credit to people going through hard times. He donated money to the volunteer fire brigade. He served on the town council. He became exactly what every small town needed: a reliable man who showed up and did the work. Nobody suspected George Schaefer was anyone other than who he claimed to be. Why would they? He'd been in Australia for decades. He had an Australian wife and Australian children. He owned a business and paid his taxes. He was boring in the best way possible. Just another pub owner in another small town. Then 1975 arrived with a routine liquor license inspection that changed everything. The inspector noticed discrepancies in Georg's naturalisation papers. The dates didn't quite line up. Some of the documentation looked wrong. The inspector reported it to local police as a possible case of document fraud. When police investigated, they discovered something shocking. George Schaefer's immigration records didn't exist because George Schaefer had never officially entered the country. Cross-referencing with old military records revealed the truth. George Schaefer was Georg Scheuerler, German prisoner of war, escaped in 1945, presumed dead for 30 years. The arrest made national headlines. Newspapers across Australia ran the story. German POW found after 30 years. Living in plain sight, running a country pub. Reporters descended on Bungendore looking for scandal. They found something different instead. They found a man who'd become Australian in every way that mattered. They found a community that rallied around him. The trial became a media sensation. Georg's lawyer presented an unusual defence. His client hadn't escaped to continue fighting. He'd escaped to stay in the country he'd learned to love. Character witnesses lined up to testify. The mayor of Bungendore, Georg's employees from the pub, farming families who'd known him for decades. Even the son of Cooper, the station owner from 1942, travelled to court to speak on Georg's behalf. One farmer testified that Georg had fixed his tractor 17 times over 20 years, never asked for more than fair wages, always stayed for tea afterwards. Another testified that Georg had helped organise the town's charity fundraiser every year for a decade. A third described how Georg had driven through a storm to help deliver a breech calf when the regular vet couldn't make it. The judge faced a problem with no precedent. Technically, Georg had escaped custody and violated immigration law. These were serious crimes. But he'd committed no other crimes during his 30 years of freedom. He'd paid taxes, raised a family, built a business, contributed to his community. He'd become exactly the kind of immigrant any country would want. The courtroom was packed when the judge delivered his sentence. Time served from the original internment, plus a £500 fine. That was all. The moment the judge finished speaking, the courtroom erupted in applause. People cheered. Georg's wife cried. His children hugged him. The judge banged his gavel for order, but he was smiling too. The government granted Georg permanent residency almost immediately. Citizenship followed soon after. The publicity actually helped the pub. The Rose and Crown became a minor tourist attraction. People drove to Bungendore just to meet the famous escaped prisoner who'd hidden for 30 years. Georg would sometimes tell his story to curious visitors. He'd explain about the oranges and the ice and the children with rubber balls. About the moment he understood everything he'd been told was a lie. In a television interview in 1978, a reporter asked if he ever regretted not returning to Stuttgart. Georg's answer was simple and direct. I escaped to Australia, not from it. I went to where the ice cream was real, and the children were healthy, and men threw away good tobacco. Why would I leave paradise? He ran the Rose and Crown until his death in 1989. He was 72 years old. More than 300 people attended his funeral. People from across New South Wales. Farmers he'd helped. Customers who'd become friends. Town council members. Football players he'd coached as boys who were now men with their own children. They buried him in Bungendore Cemetery under a simple headstone that told the truth in 8 words. Georg Scheuerler found his home far from home. The real prison, it turned out, had never been the barbed wire or the guard towers. The real prison was the lie. The lie that Germany was strong and its enemies were weak. The lie that scarcity was noble and abundance was wrong. The lie that told young men they were fighting for survival, when really they were fighting for leaders who'd chosen war over peace. Georg escaped that prison in 1942, the moment he saw the truth. It just took 3 more years for his body to follow where his mind had already gone. And in the end, he didn't escape from anything. He escaped to something. To a place where orange crates sat in the sun and nobody went hungry. To a country that had enough and knew it. To a life that felt like freedom because it finally was.